My name is Camille Rhodes. I'm 29 years old. I work as an interior designer in Miami, Florida, and 4 months ago at my own engagement party, a woman I had never met walked through the door wearing the exact vintage Art Deco emerald-cut ring I had shown my fiancé a photo of 8 months earlier. The one he told me with a genuinely convincing amount of disappointment in his voice had been discontinued by the designer before he could order it for me. I want to tell you what that ring actually meant and what I found out over the following 3 weeks. Because by the end of it, the woman wearing my dream ring turned out to be far less guilty than the man who had put it on her finger in the first place. Before I get into it, if you've ever been told something you wanted simply didn't exist anymore only to find out later that it did, just not for you, this story is for you. Subscribe if that resonates and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight because I genuinely read every single one. I need to tell you about Trevor first because none of this makes sense without understanding exactly who I thought I was marrying. I met Trevor Ashford 3 years ago at a mutual friend's gallery opening, and he was by every visible measure exactly the kind of partner I'd always imagined for myself. Successful in commercial real estate, charming in a polished, confident way, generous with his time and attention in the early months, in a way that felt at the time like genuine devotion. His family had real money, old Miami money, the kind attached to a last name people recognized at country clubs and charity galas. I fell for him slowly, and then completely the way you do, when someone seems to be studying you carefully enough to know exactly what you need before you ask for it. In the 2 years leading up to the proposal, Trevor had built himself into my life so thoroughly that untangling the good parts from the calculated parts still takes me by surprise some mornings even now. He remembered my mother's chemotherapy schedule the year she was sick and showed up at appointments with coffee for both of us without being asked. He learned the names of every difficult client at my design firm and could ask about them by name. Months later, the kind of detail that felt at the time like proof of how closely he actually listened. Looking back now with everything I know, I've had to sit with an uncomfortable possibility that some people are simply extraordinarily good at making attention feel like love, when really it's just a very refined kind of management, the same skill set applied to a different kind of client. He proposed 14 months ago on a private boat at sunset, with a ring I genuinely loved. A classic solitaire elegant understated. I said yes without hesitation, crying the kind of tears you only cry once or twice in a lifetime, genuinely certain in that specific golden light that I'd found exactly the life I wanted. It was only afterward, in the quiet, ordinary months of actual engagement planning, seating charts and venue deposits and cake tastings, that I mentioned almost in passing during a conversation about wedding bands a specific vintage ring design I'd been quietly obsessed with for years, a 1920s-style emerald-cut stone in a mil-grain platinum setting, the exact kind of piece you find in an estate jewelry collection and never see again. I showed him a photo from a jeweler's archived catalog, an antique dealer in New York, who specialized in exactly that era, and told him half-joking that if he ever wanted to surprise me with an upgrade someday, that was the one. I remember him studying that photo for a long moment, longer than felt strictly necessary for a passing comment, and I remember feeling touched by how seriously he seemed to take it. Trevor came back to me 2 weeks later with genuine-sounding disappointment. He'd called the jeweler himself, he said, and been told the specific piece and the designer's entire remaining stock of that particular vintage style had been sold as a complete estate lot to a private collector months earlier. Discontinued. Gone. He'd apologized like a man genuinely grieving a plan that hadn't worked out, and I'd told him honestly that it didn't matter that my existing ring was already beautiful, that it was a silly sentimental wish anyway. I want you to hold on to that entire exchange because it's going to matter enormously in about 10 minutes. Our engagement party was held 4 months ago at a rooftop venue overlooking Biscayne Bay. Roughly 120 guests, Trevor's extended family, his business associates, my own close circle of friends and colleagues. The venue had string lights strung between the palm trees, a jazz trio playing near the bar. The exact kind of golden, glossy evening you plan for months, and hope goes exactly this smoothly. My mother had flown in from Georgia for it, And I remember catching her eye across the rooftop at one point, both of us simply smiling at each other. The specific quiet joy of a parent watching a daughter's life fall into place exactly the way she'd hoped it would. I remember standing near the bar with my best friend Alicia, genuinely happy, genuinely at ease, my third glass of champagne, warming slightly in my hand, when a woman I didn't recognize walked in with a small group I assumed belonged to Trevor's work colleagues. She was laughing at something one of them had said, animated, comfortable, clearly not a stranger to whoever she'd arrived with. If you're already curious, stay with me because it gets much more interesting before it resolves. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely read every single one. I noticed her hand first, honestly, before I noticed anything else about her because she was gesturing animatedly while telling a story to the people beside her, and the ring on her finger caught the rooftop lighting in a very specific, unmistakable way. Emerald cut. Mill-grain platinum setting. The exact vintage silhouette from that archived catalog photo I'd shown Trevor 8 months earlier. I told myself, standing there with a glass of champagne slowly warming in my hand, that it had to be a coincidence, a similar style from a different era entirely. Vintage rings aren't actually that rare if you know where to look. I want you to understand that I genuinely tried to talk myself out of what I was seeing, because the alternative felt too enormous to hold standing in the middle of my own engagement party. Alicia, following my gaze, went very still beside me. "Camille," she said quietly. "Isn't that the ring? The one from the catalog you showed me." I made my way across the rooftop toward the woman, my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest, and introduced myself as the host, asking as casually as I could manage where she'd gotten such a beautiful ring. She smiled, genuinely warm, entirely unaware of what she was about to say. "Oh, thank you. My fiancé actually had it custom sourced through an antique dealer in New York, some incredible vintage piece from the 1920s. He surprised me with it about 6 months ago." I asked her, my voice somehow staying level despite everything happening inside my chest, who her fiancé was. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the small cluster of Trevor's colleagues near the bar, and pointed directly at him. "Trevor. Trevor Ashford. Have you two met?" I want to pause the story here and ask you something, because I've thought about it constantly since. If you were standing at your own engagement party and a stranger pointed at your fiancé and called him hers, what would you have done in that exact next second? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely don't remember making the decision to stay calm. It simply happened, some old instinct taking over before my mind fully caught up. "I'm Camille," I said, watching her face carefully. "Trevor's fiancé. His actual fiancé. We're celebrating our engagement tonight." I watched her expression shift through several stages very quickly. Confusion first, then a kind of dawning, horrified recognition. Her hand instinctively moving to cover the ring as though hiding it now could undo the last 30 seconds. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. Trevor told me he was engaged to someone else years ago, that it ended before we met, that this was our engagement party tonight at this venue, this exact date." I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, because in that single sentence I understood that this woman genuinely believed as completely as I did that she was the one actually marrying Trevor Ashford. Her name, I learned within the next several minutes, was Sophie Larkin, 27, an event planner who had met Trevor 14 months ago, the exact same month I would later confirm that he had proposed to me on that boat at sunset. I want to be honest that the next 20 minutes of that party are somewhat blurred in my memory. A controlled, quiet chaos of pulling Trevor aside, watching his face go through the exact panic then calculation sequence I imagine now happens to men caught this specifically, this publicly. He tried in a low, urgent voice to tell me it wasn't what it looked like, that Sophie meant nothing, that he could explain everything if I just gave him a chance to do it privately. I looked at Sophie, still standing near the bar, visibly shaking now, and made a decision I've thought about many times since. "I think you and I need to talk," I told her, away from him. She nodded, and the two of us walked to a quieter corner of the rooftop, While Trevor stood alone in the middle of his own unraveling engagement party, Sophie and I compared notes for nearly 40 minutes that night, standing at the railing overlooking the bay. And what emerged was a picture far more calculated than either of us had understood on our own. Trevor had proposed to her 9 months ago in a private, intimate dinner with the same ring style I'd wanted, the exact vintage design I'd shown him in that catalog photo. Purchased, we would later confirm, directly through the same New York antique dealer he'd told me had sold out. He had told Sophie he was recently out of a long relationship that had ended badly, that he wanted their engagement kept quiet from his extended, difficult family for a while before making it public. He had told her their wedding was being planned for 8 months from now. He had told her specifically that tonight's rooftop party was their engagement celebration hosted by his family, though he'd need her to arrive slightly late and mingle mostly with his colleagues rather than his immediate family, framing it as an easing-in process given how private he'd kept things. By February, 4 months after the elopement, the first cracks started showing, though I only learned the details secondhand through my mother, who couldn't seem to help herself from occasionally passing along updates, despite my clear request that she stop. Marcus's job at the hotel chain grew unstable. His division underwent a restructuring, and according to my mother, his performance had slipped in a way that made him an easy name to cut when the layoffs came in March. Bianca, meanwhile, had been financing a lifestyle. Neither of their actual salaries fully supported a downtown condo with a $2,800 monthly rent, a leased BMW, a wedding-adjacent honeymoon to Tulum that ran well past what either of them had budgeted for, all of it, as far as I could tell, held together by credit rather than any real financial planning. By April, Marcus was unemployed, and the financial strain apparently exposed something in their relationship that the initial excitement had been covering for. My mother mentioned almost apologetically that Bianca had started complaining to her about Marcus not being who she thought he was, the exact same phrase I noted privately that could have described the entire situation from the very beginning. I remember laughing out loud alone in my kitchen when my mother relayed that particular complaint, a laugh with almost no humor in it at all. I built my own life carefully during those months, deliberately, the way you rebuild something after a fire, slower than you'd like, but with better materials the second time. I got promoted in March to senior associate at my firm, a role I'd been quietly working toward for 2 years, closing a $4.2 million commercial lease deal that became internally something of a small legend at the office. I started seeing a therapist weekly, unpacking not just the engagement's collapse, but years of smaller patterns with Bianca I'd never fully examined. I started dating again carefully months later. Nothing serious yet, but enough to remember what it felt like to be treated like someone's first choice instead of a placeholder. The call came in late April. Marcus, not Bianca. I almost didn't answer, staring at his name on my screen for 3 full rings before curiosity, or something closer to morbid closure, won out, sitting down slowly on the edge of my bed before I finally hit accept. "Camille," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't slept well in days. "I know I have no right to call you. I needed to say I'm sorry. Really sorry, not the version I gave you before." I asked him what had changed 6 months later that made an apology suddenly feel urgent, keeping my voice deliberately, even refusing to let him hear whatever was actually happening in my chest as I listened. "Bianca and I are getting divorced," he said. "It's been a mess for months. I lost my job. She's not who I thought she was, Camille. I think some part of me always knew that, even before all this. I just told myself the excitement meant something more than it actually did." He paused, and I could hear him exhale shakily on the other end. "I keep thinking about how good things were with you before I ruined it. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know I finally see it clearly." I let the silence sit for a long moment before I answered. "You didn't just lose a relationship with her, Marcus. You broke something with me on the way to it. Those are 2 different things, and only one of them is actually about you losing something you're sad about tonight." He showed up at my apartment 3 weeks later unannounced at 11 at night, in the middle of a genuine downpour soaked through his coat, standing on my doorstep like he'd rehearsed the moment on the drive over and lost the script somewhere in the parking lot. My porch light flickered slightly the way it always did in heavy rain, casting his face in an unflattering shifting light that somehow made the whole scene feel even more pathetic than it already was. I opened the door partway, not inviting him in, just enough to hear him, one hand still on the deadbolt. "I made the worst mistake of my life," he said, water dripping off his jaw, his voice cracking slightly, his shoulders hunched against the cold. "I know I don't deserve this, but I had to say it in person. I love you." I never stopped. I was an idiot, and I threw away the one relationship that was actually real for something that turned out to be exactly as shallow as it should have looked from the outside. I stood there for a long moment looking at him, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in that exact moment. Not the devastation I'd braced for, not even much anger anymore. Mostly just a strange, quiet clarity, the kind that only arrives once you've actually finished grieving something instead of still being in the middle of it. "Marcus," I said finally, 6 months ago, "you chose someone else 2 weeks before our wedding, and now that it's fallen apart, you're standing on my porch in the rain asking me to be your backup plan. I spent those 6 months building a life that doesn't have room in it for someone who only wants me now because his first choice didn't work out. I hope the divorce goes as smoothly as it can, but I'm not the door you get to knock on when the one you actually chose closes behind you." I closed the door gently, not slamming it, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet final click of the lock. I stood in my hallway for a few minutes afterward, listening to the rain, waiting to see if I'd feel regret. I didn't. What I felt mostly was something closer to relief. The specific relief of watching a door you used to want desperately open finally close on its own terms, with you standing safely on the right side of it. I texted Naomi that night just 3 words. He showed up. She called immediately, and I told her everything. And somewhere in the middle of describing his face in the rain, I realized I was laughing not cruelly, just genuinely at how small the whole thing suddenly felt compared to how enormous it had once seemed. My mother called 2 days later, having heard some version of events from Bianca, still trying even now to find an angle where reconciliation made sense to her. "He's really struggling, Camille. Maybe if you two just talked properly without all the anger." "Mom," I said, "I'm not angry anymore. That's actually the whole point. I don't need him to suffer, and I don't need to punish him. I just don't want him. Those are different things, and I need you to actually hear the difference this time." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear for the first time in this entire ordeal something that sounded like her actually absorbing what I'd said, instead of already planning her next attempt to smooth things over. Bianca and Marcus's divorce finalized in July. I heard secondhand that she moved back in with our parents temporarily, and that the two of them have barely spoken since the shared betrayal apparently not having built the kind of bond either of them expected it to. My mother told me in a rare moment of honesty that Bianca had cried for an entire evening after the final papers were signed, not over losing Marcus specifically, but over realizing how little of what she'd taken had actually turned out to be worth having. My mother still occasionally tries to bridge the distance between Bianca and me, and I've told her calmly and repeatedly that I'm open to a relationship with my sister again someday, but only one built on an actual accounting of what she did not. A quiet hope that enough time will make the accounting unnecessary. I'm still at the same firm a director now, as of this fall, managing a portfolio that includes 3 of the largest commercial leases in the metro area. A title and a salary I built entirely on my own timeline, with no one else's collapse required to get there. I'm seeing someone new, slowly, carefully, someone who's never once made me feel like a placeholder for anyone else's second choice, someone who asks about my day and actually waits for the answer instead of already thinking about his next sentence. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust the specific shape of romantic promises again the way I once did, but I trust myself now in a way I don't think I ever fully did before all of this happened, and that feels like the actually valuable thing I walked away with. Naomi still brings up that porch scene sometimes, usually when we're catching up over wine. laughing now in a way that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Not laughing at the pain of it, but at how far away it finally feels. How small it turned out to actually be once enough time and enough of my own rebuilding had passed. I keep a framed photo now on my bookshelf, not of Marcus, not of that canceled wedding, but of the view from my office on the day I closed the $4.2 million lease. A small private reminder of the version of myself that came out the other side of all of this stronger than the version that walked into it. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever watched someone come crawling back only after their first choice fell apart, tell me what you said or what you wish you had. I want to know we're not alone in this. My sister spent 3 months deciding my fiancé was worth taking, and 6 months later, both of them found out exactly how much less he was worth once the excitement wore off, and the actual work of loving someone honestly finally came due. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to feel sorry for the version of me who stood in that kitchen reading a hotel receipt, like it might rearrange itself into something less devastating. I tell it because I think a lot of people at some point get handed the choice. I got handed on that porch in the rain, the choice to let someone back in, simply because they finally admitted what should have been obvious from the start, or to recognize that an apology arriving only after their better option collapsed was never really about you at all. I chose myself that night. It's still the best decision I made in the entire mess.